Hi there, my name is Robin, and welcome to Only the Best Fantasy Novels. To wrap up my first month as a brand new, freshly minted booktube channel, I wanted to talk about a series that I saw someone mention isn't very much discussed on booktube, and that would be The Sword of Shannara by Terry Brooks. So, The Sword of Shannara is the original trilogy of the Shannara series, which has gone well past 30 novels. It's one of the most beloved classic fantasy series of all time. And it's a world that has become a very unique fantasy saga in its own right. I thought it would be fun to share my perspective on this trilogy, and I think it's also important to discuss some considerations to factor in when it comes to reading this series as a modern reader in 2024. It's important to understand that this is a very old series. It was literally published in the late 70s, and in I think mid to late 70s, and it's very much a product of its time. It's approaching 50 years old. Let that sink in. As a result, fantasy has changed so much over the last 50 years that this series may not necessarily appeal to modern readers, or it would at least it would probably appeal only to those with a more with a unique with with a unique love of the genre. People who tend to like classic novels more, classic fantasy a bit more, or people who have a lot of nostalgia for the series, having read it when growing up, or read it early on, or even it being their gateway into the fantasy genre as a whole. Um, my perspective will be informed by what little I know of the history of the genre, and from having read two of the many Shannara trilogies out there. I've read the original trilogy, and I've read the much later Defender of Shannara series. So I had the opportunity to see how Terry Brooks eventually goes on to make the world of Shannara his own. And you'll understand why I keep saying why he makes it his own as I discuss the novels. Um, so it's important to remember that this was written at a time where Tolkien was becoming very popular. I once saw something online where someone was saying that Tolkien was just becoming very popular. Even the printing of mass market paperbacks and books of that nature being more accessible to readers. Um, these things all played a factor into the success of Shannara and Lester Del Rey's um, business acumen, looking for seeing a demand for fiction along the lines of Tolkien, and giving Terry Brooks an opportunity which has led to this has led to Shannara being such a such a iconic novel, an iconic series within the fantasy genre, and given its place in the history of the given its place in the history of the genre as it developed. Um, it's important to know, going straight into this, that it was meant to be it was meant to capitalize on Tolkien. As such, a lot of it is a lot of it copies what Tolkien did. Um, Obviously, Terry Brooks, he put his own coat of paint on it, so it's not like you're gonna read all about. It's not like you're gonna read all about the Nazgul and the Witch King of Angmar and Sauron and all of that. Terry Brooks put his own phrases and his own names to them, and I'll discuss that more in depth as I get to each book. He also has a much less sophisticated way of writing, a much more accessible way of writing, and I feel like that is part of the heavy appeal of this series. It made it a lot easier for a lot more people, a lot of younger readers to really get into it and to really enjoy it, who may not necessarily have enjoyed Lord of the Rings, if that had been their first taste of fantasy. One thing that I think very few readers will argue is that Shannara did pave the way for the start of modern fantasy, heavily influenced by Tolkien and epic fantasy. And with all of that being said about its relationship with Tolkien, Shannara very much becomes its own series as it develops over time. Terry Brooks puts his own creativity on things, and by the end, I would say there's very little resemblance, other than that essential kernel being there. But anyway, maybe it's best let me just get straight into talking about the novels. So obviously, I'll start with the Sword of Shannara, which is the very first novel of the trilogy, and it's the most derivative of the Shannara novels. It's there's almost no point discussing what happens in this book because the essential plot is very much what happens in Lord of the Rings. The only difference is Terry Brooks puts his... The only major spin I saw is Terry Brooks, his main character, is not as passive as Frodo. He's much more active. So instead of having to transport a ring to throw into a lava pit, our main character has a mythical sword that only an heir of the land can wield, and he has to use it to defeat the evil Warlock Lord. Yeah, Warlock Lord. Other than that, this novel is basically just much more blandly written, with a very with the races swapped out and different names on different things. Like instead of Nazgul, we have Skullbearers. Instead of Sauron, we have the Warlock Lord. Yeah, it's you get an idea of the imagination involved here. I think the world of Shannara is divided into Northlands, Southlands, Westlands, and Eastlands. They have their own races with elves and dwarves, I believe. Maybe not. It's been a while since I've read this. There are definitely elves. But yeah, it made the essential Tolkien template it presented it in a much more accessible way, which made it appeal to a much broader audience. That's the essential gist of it. My personal experience with this book, it's okay. It's not going to rock your boat. It is what it is. It is a product of its time, and if you enter this reading experience expecting to be blown out of the water because of all the love and all the hype you hear about this series and its place within the fantasy genre, you will be disappointed. Which is why I started this video by discussing a little of Shannara's influences and its place in the fantasy genre. I think you will have a better experience reading this book if you walk into it with your eyes wide open on what it is. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say on the Sword of Shannara. Moving on, the next book in the trilogy is the Elfstones of Shannara. This is also very derivative of Tolkien, but here we see Terry Brooks start to form his own mythos, put a little more of his own creativity into the story, start to be a little more exploratory in what he decides to do. So we get a call to arms for a completely different member of the Ormsford family, which is the family at the heart of the Shannara series. And in this particular novel, instead of having to defeat an evil warlord or warlock lord, what we have is a tree that's dying, the Elkris. And this tree is important because it's the source of a powerful magic that banishes demons from the land and helps to keep the land safe. And with the tree dying, the wards that are preventing the demons are starting to fail. So it's essentially a quest for a member of the Umsword family to assist an elf in creating a brand new Elkris to reinforce the banishment. So like I said, this is where Terry Brooks starts to get a little more creative, put his own spin on the story, and odds are very high you'll probably enjoy this a little more than you did the Sword of Shannara. Would it blow your mind and rock your world? Probably not, but it would probably make for a few hours comfortable reading. If you keep in mind that this is very much classic fantasy, this is very much a story heavily inspired by Tolkien, and it's not trying to do too much new under the sun. Just take it at face value for what it is, read it, and have as much fun as you can. And then the third novel of the trilogy is the Wishsong of Shannara. And at this point, you'll probably wonder why, if you're a member of the Umsword family, you don't run screaming in the other direction when you see the druid Alanon coming in your direction. If it was me, I'd run screaming. But we have yet another call to arms for yet another descendant of the Umsword family to save the land of Shannara. It's once again, it's the same basic structure, the same basic plot as Lord of the Rings, but there's even more deviation in terms of the creativity and in terms of the imagination, because for me this was the book where Terry Brooks really started to come into his own. There's enough of that slapped onto this book that odds are very high it will be the most enjoyed of the trilogy for most readers. I think it was the one I enjoyed the most of the three. I won't discuss what it's about. You can check that out online fairly easily. But yeah, that's kind of my overall experience reading the Sword of Shannara trilogy. It wasn't a bad one. It was a pretty cozy read. I read it out of curiosity. I went into this eyes wide open, and I think that's why I kind of had a much more pleasant experience than I expected to. It's not. Can I recommend this? Can I recommend you read this? If you're curious to know what the story is about, and you understand that, once again, that you understand the place that these novels have in the genre as a whole, I think you'll have a fairly decent experience of it. It's not going to rock your world, it's not going to blow your mind or anything, but it is a pleasant way to pass a few hours, especially if you're a reader of a more classic type of fantasy, or you have more nostalgia for the fantasy of this time period. It's easy enough to see why these novels have such a unique place in the hearts of many older fantasy readers especially. All in all, yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. What do you think about the Sword of Shannara trilogy? Was it your gateway into fantasy, as it was so many people? Or are you thinking about reading this series? Did I convince you to try it, or did I just make it sound even less appealing than it might have before? Let me know in the comments, and if you made it this far, thank you very much.